Hello again. It's fashionable today to decry the achievements of colonialism in Africa, and many modern people tend to lay the blame for all the problems in Africa at the door of the white people who colonised the continent. I don't think it's true by any objective standard that Africa has improved in any material way since the end of colonialism, but there we are. It's an ideological claim, and it shouldn't really be discounted for that. Obviously, freedom is an important thing in itself, regardless of living conditions, life expectancy, and so on. It's history shows us that people often value freedom over an improvement in living conditions, or indeed life itself. Of course, those who choose to sacrifice a little comfort for the sake of freedom often end up with neither freedom nor any sort of improvement in their lives at all. That's the case for revolutions throughout the world. It's not limited to Africa. Very often, radical movements promise to deliver so much and in the end deliver hardly anything. It may certainly be seen in the supposed liberation of Rhodesia from white rule, which took place in 1980. In the 1960s, Rhodesia was an example to the whole of Africa in how to manage a country and an economy efficiently. It was known at that time as the breadbasket of Africa due to the huge amount of land under cultivation, and it exported grain to the rest of the continent. It's true that white people in the country had a better standard of living than black people, but the black population benefited enormously from the prosperity too. By the time that independence came in 1980, the life expectancy at birth of a black person in Rhodesia was 60. Within 30 years of the end of white rule, this had almost halved, and Zimbabwe had the lowest life expectancy in the entire world. The country had gone from being a breadbasket to a basket case, in the worst state than almost every other African nation, in fact. The end of white rule had proved to be a catastrophe for ordinary people in Rhodesia. When independence came for the country, agriculture was flourishing, the economy was strong, and everybody, black and white, had enough to eat. Within a few decades, there was famine and ruin. The actual cause of the disaster was very simple. And although a lot of complicated explanations have been advanced involving colonialism and all sorts of other difficult subjects, I use the principle of Occam's razor most of the time when I look at things like this, which holds that the simplest explanation is usually the one to go for. In this case, the simplest explanation was a desire to avoid delayed gratification by planning ahead, which was something that the white rulers of Rhodesia were very good at, and the new black leaders apparently were not. Now, this may sound racist, I'm sure it will to some people, but black people themselves have identified the very idea of planning for the future and delaying gratification in the hope of future gain as being part of a specifically white set of values. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in America published a list of things which they claimed were associated with whiteness. Among these were the idea that hard work brings success, that planning for the future is important, and that delayed gratification is a worthwhile sacrifice. In other words, the black people that drew up this list saw these things as specifically white ideas, part of a white ideology. Objective rational thinking was another white value, as was the idea of cause and effect relationships. Since these ideas have been advanced by black people themselves, it can hardly be considered racist to examine the implications. In the context of Zimbabwe's collapse, it was a reluctance to plan for future harvests and to put away stores for years to come which caused famine. When once there had been enough grain to export, now there wasn't enough even for the people in the country to eat. The expropriated white lands were allowed to lie fallow, just nothing grew on them at all. And the idea of investing time and effort in the hope of a reward in future years seemed difficult to grasp for those that now held the land. The people in political control of the country simply stole as much as they were able and sorted it away in Swiss bank accounts. And they didn't consider for a moment the long-term implications of their actions. It was this, above all else, which destroyed the country, the apparent inability to plan ahead and think for the future. Interestingly, certainly admittedly there were controversial experiments were carried out with children in various countries. A lot of this stuff was done in the 70s. It's not so popular now because the implications are not really as acceptable as they might once have been. These experiments seem to show that delaying gratification is more frequent in white children than it is in black children. Since its presence in children is associated with better outcomes in later life, which is hardly surprising, it's the implications of this are fairly serious. Essentially, things were done such as offering children 1 sweet now or 2 sweets if they waited for half an hour or so. And it seemed to be the case that black children would prefer to take the sweet immediately, whereas white children had a tendency to wait and then get a reward in the future. Obviously, there's a lot of complicating factors here. Primarily class, social class has an effect on the extent to which people are prepared to delay their gratifications. The working classes in Britain are notoriously supposed to be keen only on having beer and tobacco today rather than to be thinking of the future at all. So these experiments are controversial, and they were at the time. It's curious, though, that a number of black activists are the kind who produced the checklist of so-called white behaviours that I looked at earlier should be so dismissive of planning for the future and delaying gratification that they should regard these as white virtues. It's upon such things that the success of European countries and the United States are founded. And looking at the history of post-colonial Africa, it's highly possible that the failure to thrive of nations in that continent since the end of colonialism is strongly connected with the lack of such values and inclinations. In other words, once they abandoned the white ideas of planning for the future and cause and effect and rational and linear thinking, these were all identified also by activists in America, black activists being white values. It's possible that since abandoning those ideas, it's resulted in the impoverishment of Africa that we've certainly seen since the 1950s and 60s.